Hey, it's Steve. Well, have you ever wondered about railroads in the US, at least the big class one railroads? What the biggest one is, the number of locomotives in service, number and types of freight cars in service, the actual geographies that each railroad covers, those types of things? Well, we're going to look at all of that in this video. All right, well, I had been kind of going down a rabbit hole looking up information on railroads and such, and I decided I might as well just compile a bunch of the stuff I was looking at together, put it on some slides, and share it with all of you, because maybe you have some of those same interests or wonder some of those same questions as well. So anyway, let's start off looking at some of the revenue and freight type information on US railroads here. So first off, there is currently now 6 Class 1 railroads since the Canadian Pacific and the Kansas City Southern just recently merged. So we've gone from 7 to 6, although those were the 2 smallest ones. And so you can see here on the right-hand side, they are still the smallest when they're combined even, not quite as big as Norfolk Southern or CSX or Canadian National, but that does now put them on parity with those other 3. But you can see certainly that the BNSF and Union Pacific are kind of in a class of their own in terms of size. They each make up about 25% of the total revenue of the Class 1 railroads here in the US. So certainly they're by themselves, and everyone else is kind of more or less on par. Now, in terms of the number of freight cars in service in the US, there's about 1.6 million total, at least based on this graphic that I found here. What was interesting, though, was 568,000 of those were covered hoppers. That was the most prevalent kind of rail car, followed secondly by tank cars. So, that's going to be taking petroleum products, all kinds of chemicals, liquefied gases, certainly a lot of things like ethanol, as well. So a lot of products are shipped by tank car, even, things like dairy products like milk and such. So those were interestingly the 2 most common types of rail cars that are out there. The common box car, which you think there are a lot of, there's only about 100,000 of those currently in service. So definitely the lowest of all the common freight cars is the boxcar in terms of absolute numbers. So that was kind of interesting, I thought. So in terms of the total volume of freight that's transported, rail makes up about 28% of that. You can see trucking is about 40%. So certainly rail is definitely less than trucking overall, but a lot of goods aren't just served from one end to the other of the whole line of transport just by one mode of transportation. Many go through multiple phases. So you might have something obviously like intermodal containers that start off, coming across the Pacific on a ship. They get transported to a train. Eventually they get attached to a truck. And so they can really go through a lot of different phases. But that's just overall, according to this graphic, rail made up about 28%. Now, in terms of the lines that are most heavily trafficked, so the most heavily trafficked lines here are across the central U.S., actually from Wyoming towards Kansas City in that area there. A lot of that is coal traffic in that region there. The green lines, though, are all the areas that have the next level of traffic. And so a lot of those are the west to east routes, a lot of intermodal traffic probably coming from the port of LA, going east to Chicago or New York City or vice versa, and that kind of thing. But you can kind of get an idea that there's definitely a lot of concentration here across the middle part of the country. Now, in terms of number of locomotives, there's about 24,000 locomotives in active service on Class 1 railroads, at least as of this data here in 2019. I don't think this is actually of 2019. I think it was probably through 2015 or something, but it was reported in 2019 at least. Anyway, based on that report, 31% of the active locomotives were built prior to 1995, and then around 15% every 5-year period after that. So 17% were from 2000 to 2004, 16% from 95 to 99, 15% 2005 to 2009, and so on. So, but overall, you can see about almost a third of all locomotives, at least at that time, were built prior to 1995, or basically were 20 to 25 years old or older. So locomotives have a very long lifespan. They can last for many decades. Or certainly locomotives that are, built in the 70s and 60s still in active service. And so a lot of longevity in locomotives. And so until there's an actual real need to replace them, a lot of times they keep on living on, maybe getting passed down from Class 1 to, the lower, smaller regional railroads and short lines and those kinds of things. But they do last for a very long time. Now, this chart I think is interesting. I put this together comparing carload units for 2020 and 1980 in this tree map here to kind of give you an idea of the overall relative size of each type of freight. So there was 26.5 million carload units shipped in 2020. Now that might not be the best year to look at because that was obviously an odd year in terms of things. But you can see at that time, 42% of the traffic was intermodal traffic, whereas if you go back to 1980, only 10% was intermodal and 26% was coal at the time. Only 11% of the traffic was coal in 2020. And as someone who's worked with the energy industry for the last 25 years, I can tell you with certainty that the coal traffic is going to be declining quite a bit further as we go forward here in the coming years. So natural gas has displaced a lot of the coal. Obviously, you can transport natural gas by pipeline. It's cheaper to transport. Fuel is cheaper. The plants are cheaper to operate. Everything else, and then plus obviously you have renewables like wind and stuff that have been growing. But natural gas has really taken over most of the coal, and so likely that will continue to decline in the coming years, at least until something happens and there's some other dramatic shift in fuel usage down the road. But you can kind of see here with chemicals, a lot of the other things haven't really changed as much, but there are a few that have. Lumber is only about 1% now, but it used to be 6% 40 years ago, so that's really declined quite a bit. But things like autos are still around 4%. That's kind of a steady state thing. Unless you have a dramatic population change, there's not a huge amount of shift in the number of automobiles that are purchased each year, kind of replacing an old one with a new one and that kind of thing. And so there's, it's relatively flat. So a lot of that isn't a huge surprise. Grain, is fairly similar as well, over the last 40 years. Most of the agricultural land in 1980 is still agricultural land today. Maybe some areas have been taken away by housing, but overall, it's not a dramatic difference in terms of overall, acres. And so while there has been probably some slight reduction, overall food production efficiency has increased and everything else. So but basically it's kind of evened out. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of change in that. So now looking at some rail network maps, here's a map of all the Class 1 railroads here across the U.S. You can see that distinct density here across the central and eastern portions of the country. Looking at each railroad by itself, the BNSF certainly dominates a lot of the western 2/3 of the country. Everything from Chicago westward is largely covered by the BNSF. Now, Union Pacific here is kind of hard to see. This yellow on this plot that I pulled here from the website doesn't show up very well, but you can certainly see again Chicago westward for the Union Pacific, but not as much coverage here in Montana and the Dakotas compared to the BNSF. Now, if you look elsewhere across the eastern U.S., the CSX pretty much dominates Chicago and St. Louis eastward. No big surprise there. If we jump to the Norfolk Southern, again, pretty much covering the same area. Those two overlap pretty much the same vicinity. Now, across Canada, we have the Canadian National, but also they do go all the way down to New Orleans to the port there. So coverage across the central U.S. besides just southern Canada. And then looking at the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, pretty much the same geography, southern Canada, as well as a corridor down across the central U.S. So if you look at the kind of regions here, everything kind of operates as a duopoly across North America for the most part. So the western 2/3 of the country, you have the BNSF and Union Pacific controlling everything. In the eastern U.S., you have the CSX and Norfolk Southern. And then in southern Canada, you have Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. And of course, they also service portions of the central U.S., as do every other railroad as well. So that's the one thing that's interesting about Illinois. You have the CSX, the Norfolk Southern, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern, Union Pacific, and BNSF all operating within the state of Illinois. So a very active state in terms of rail traffic from a lot of different railroads. Now, what's also interesting is looking at how geography impacts the location of rail lines, which isn't any big surprise, obviously. It's a lot easier to go around a mountain than it is to go through it or over it. And so you can see certainly a lot of the freight lines across the western U.S. do avoid, the mountain areas. So going through the Snake River Valley across Idaho, for example, or going through the Columbia Valley here between Washington and Oregon, things like that, Central Valley of California, as well as just some of the routes through the Rockies following the valleys and kind of, following river courses and those types of things, which are going to have much smaller grades overall. There are obviously some areas where, through the Central Rockies where they had to go up and over or through the mountains in those areas there. Also in the Northwest, there's some areas like that too. So, but overall, you can certainly see though, that a lot of the location of the rail lines is not, accidental by any means. Obviously, it's all because of topography in those areas. And of course, the cities are pretty much located in areas that are flatter as well, not in the mountains directly. And so that also kind of works together in that sense as well, connecting up the cities like Salt Lake City, Boise, from Denver westward, up towards the Northwest and California. So a lot of those things kind of being tied together. Now, a few other random charts here before I wrap up on train length and safety. This I thought was pretty interesting, looking at the train length of Class 1 railroads. So the median was actually around 1 mile in length, around 5,400 feet. That's about 1.6 kilometers if you're not from the US. So a pretty sizable train length for the median train length in the US. But 1% of the trains in the US are about 14,000 feet long. That's well over 2 miles in length. In fact, about 4.3 kilometers in length. So certainly there are occasionally some very long trains across the US that operate. Again, I'm sure most of those really long trains are operating across portions of central and western US where there's not really a lot of large cities, a lot of open space, those kinds of things are present there. But definitely interesting that 1%, one out of every 100 trains is going to be potentially over 2 miles in length, looking at all the trains in the US. Now, safety has improved a lot. This is a pretty impressive graphic showing that over the last 20 years, of course, obviously, I'm sure it was worse prior to 2000, but safety has improved considerably in terms of the number of accidents on railroads here in the U.S. So definitely some significant improvement in train safety. Obviously, we've had some notable train accidents this year in terms of causing releases of hazardous chemicals. However, despite that, we've seen a significant decline in that occurrence as well over the last 20 years. So without question, there has been a steady improvement in train safety over the course of the last couple of decades. So despite a couple recent occurrences, rail is still a very safe way to transport large quantities of goods. And one thing to certainly note about rail accidents is that they're almost always noted in the media. So because they're not that common, it's kind of like a plane crash. Plane crashes hardly ever happen, these days. And so anytime, one happens, it's a big news story. And same thing with a lot of these rail accidents. They don't happen very often. So when they happen, it's a big notable news story. And so it becomes very widely known. But there are so many trucking accidents, for example, that you're not going to hear about each individual one unless it's in your community, probably. But again, obviously, they're not going to be as large in terms of volume and those types of things as well. But the bottom line though here is that safety has been steadily improving by rail. Sometimes it might seem like it's increasing because of news coverage or whatever, but definitely not the case overall. So anyway, that's all I have to share with you guys. I just thought it was kind of interesting. So anyway, I hope you found it interesting as well. But that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.